about two Chinese dynasties in particular, known as the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. So technically, the Ming Dynasty lasts, and there's, you don't have to memorize anything that's like on this particular slide right here. This is just a timeline of Chinese history, going back all the way to kind of what we would call mythological China, or at least the first empire, which we don't know if actually existed. And that's the interesting thing about China, is that China has essentially like a 4,000 to 5,000 year history on the face of the earth, making it one of the longest empires that has ever lasted. And moreover, what's even, I guess, further impressive is that China has maintained, or I should say, China has maintained itself as an empire, as a broad empire from basically its original form back in like 3000 BC, 2500 BC, underneath the first Xia dynasty, all the way down to basically the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. So literally an empire that encompassed the span of 4,500 years, which is no small feat when looking at the historical record. Now, of course, China changes a lot over the course of Chinese history. Duh, obviously. But it manages, there are a couple of reasons why it manages to stay in an imperial form for so long that we'll talk about if we have the chance. But the two empires that we're going to be focusing on today are the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. So the Ming Dynasty, if we look on this timeline here of Chinese history, all the way down to the bottom right-hand corner, starting in 1368, and then the Qing Dynasty going all the way up to 1911. So we're only going to be focusing up until about the height of the Qing Dynasty in the year 1800, because after the year 1800, China and Chinese society is going to experience a very quick decline in power and authority and influence, largely due to industrialization, largely due to the Opium Wars with Britain. China is not going to be looking too good after the year 1800. But prior to that, China was one of the most powerful empires that had existed consistently on the face of the earth. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, about why that is, and also kind of make some comparisons between the Chinese dynasties and the types of things that we've seen in not only Europe, but also in the Ottoman Empire. And so that's where we are picking up today, this kind of the early modern history of China. Because China is also the reason that I kind of structure the class in the way that I do also, and this is just kind of an aside on what we'll be talking about and where we'll be going, is that this is intended, and the societies that we've looked at, that we've studied, are intended to give us a glimpse of them at different points throughout history. So we'll be returning to China in the 19th century when it is imperialized by the British, when it begins to come into contact with the Western world on really equal terms for the first time, and later on in the course we'll be looking at the Chinese Revolution, the transition to a communist China under Mao Zedong, and of course the legacy that has had and that continues to have on our modern world. Same thing with the Ottoman Empire. We'll be looking at the Ottoman Empire as we move throughout the 1700s to 1800s, and eventually how the fall of the Ottoman Empire leads to World War I, and how out of the ashes, really out of the corpse of the dead Ottoman Empire, we have a lot of these struggles and a lot of the modern issues that we face today. And same thing with basically everything. The whole point is that we're getting kind of a broad, what we might call diachronic, which diachronic is just a fancy word that simply means throughout history. So if I have let's see if I have a marker on me today. If not, it's just kind of spelled exactly what it sounds like. Dia, D-I-A, and chronic, C-H-R-O-N-I-C. But basically, just, again, this kind of analysis through time. of history. And so as we look at early modern China, and also as we've looked at the Ottoman Empire, as we've talked about this, there's one thing that I want to address very early on. And so we're going to watch about a 10-minute video on a concept or an idea in the an idea that in the past 50 years has gotten a lot of sway in academia, and especially among historians looking at the study of non-Western cultures. And so specifically, this is what is known as Orientalism, which you'll want to write this down. There will undoubtedly be some kind of question on the quiz on Monday about Orientalism, about this. But the long story short is that Orientalism is this word that historians came up with to talk about how people in the West, and when we say the West, we mean like the United States and Europe, people in the West, and how people in the West tend to view people in the East. And who is the East, you might ask? The East is everybody who's not the West. I mean, that's one of the big points of Orientalism, as we will talk about it. For example, I won't give away too much of that, because this is going to kind of be one way that we can think about and that we can talk about studying different cultures. And so basically it has to do with how the West sees the East. And this video does an excellent job of describing it, and we'll be able to use this also down the line and come back to it as an example of ways that history has traditionally been done and ways that we've thought about history. So like I said, we'll watch this video and we'll continue on from there. And so the video itself is titled Why Arabs and Muslims Aren't Exotic. And so this video focuses a lot on the Arabic perspective of things, of Orientalism, but the same type of ideas have also been applied to Asian nations like China and Japan and even Korea, Vietnam, you name it. And so all of it kind of falls together under this.
These red bottoms, these bloody shoes. Yeah, you probably heard Cardi B's hit song Bodak Yellow, and like basically everyone else, I couldn't get enough of it. That is until Cardi B released the music video. Did y'all see that? Why is she wearing a hijab with a veil in the middle of the desert?
Oh, wait, that's...
Did y'all see that? Why is she wearing a hijab with a veil in the middle of the desert? Bodak Yellow shows how music, television, and film still paint Arabs and Muslims in a highly exoticized way. And it's just one.
And like I said, we can add Chinese people, Japanese people, Vietnamese people, Korean people, all of those people, Indians, if we wanted to. Why is it that the West tends to paint them with highly exotic eyes, right? Looking at them as kind of foreign, exotic cultures, which is what this whole video is about.
Orientalism is pretty much everywhere in our pop culture. Think of Aladdin, think of Homeland, or Sacha Baron Cohen's entire career. Hi guys, I'm Omar, and this time after the fuss, we're breaking down the concept of Orientalism, where it comes from, and why and how. And just know, I'm definitely going to remove some of your childhood. And now, I'm about to drop a whole new world of knowledge. Aladdin was one of the most Orientalist films of all time. And Professor Walter Denny, who's taught Orientalist art for decades, agrees.
Like those first 3 or 4 minutes of the Disney movie Aladdin are basically very prejudicial. They create a very, very false and very, very prejudicial view of the Islamic world.
Before I upset you anymore, let me tell you why it's so bad by explaining what Orientalism is. Historically, Orientalism refers to the study of the Arab and Muslim world, or what was for a long time referred to as the Orient, which included more than just Arab or South Muslim society. And the discipline basically looks at society values as though they were interchangeable, inferior, and well, mystical and savage. Just the fact we say there's an era for Muslim growth is proof of how pervasive that way of thinking was and is. But now, we'll yeoman insert.
Right, and you can think about this too, which I'm going to pause the video occasionally to bring up relative side information. But if we think about this, I won't ask this question, nor will I ask you to show me by handing out a map of where Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan are all on a map, but as I've done in the past, it's been kind of disappointing too. But again, it's kind of this idea that, as it turns out, when we, especially as Westerners, think of the Middle East, right, we tend to just imagine some kind of one-size-fits-all conglomerate area to the whole thing, right? This holds true. There's a reason I don't actually do this, because I find it's a bit disappointing. So I won't embarrass anyone today. But if we look at the whole vast area, so for example, if we were to just go to Iran on Google Maps, right? This whole area here that we're looking at is the Middle East, as we typically refer to it, right? Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Yemen, Oman. Over here, Iran, Afghanistan. Did you know that Afghanistan was separated from Iraq by Iran? Most Americans don't. And this is the thing, right? Also, and one thing this video will bring up is that it's kind of odd that we refer to this as the Middle East, since there's actually, if we look at the map, like, really the Middle East should be like India or even parts of China, if we look at that, right? But overall, we have this tendency as Westerners and as people who just simply live in the United States or live in Europe, because again, this isn't just like an American thing, right? This tendency to take all of these different places and to just kind of smush them together into one big just blob of foreign of that. Like, for example, how many of you guys in here have seen the original Disney, Aladdin? Right, I'd assume most, if not all. Right, so there's the city of Agrabah, and in the city of Agrabah, there is the palace. And I'm going to look at a picture of that real quick, of the palace in Agrabah, okay? So here we go, the Sultan's Palace in Agrabah, right? Pretty iconic, it's on the front of the VHS and the DVD, right? We think about Aladdin, we're probably thinking about this. Now, Aladdin is supposed to be set in, like, Arabia, in the Middle East, right? It's supposed to be, the whole, we won't watch the opening, although, mostly because I can't find a good full version of it. But, right, this is particularly how the palace is portrayed. And if we're thinking if we are in Arabia, right, we're probably thinking that we're over here, maybe in the Middle East, right, with Saudi Arabia, maybe somewhere in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, all of this, right, the area that we normally think of. But the palace, does anybody happen to know, like, what the palace is based off of? Not archaeologically. Does anybody happen to know, like, what historical construction this palace is, like, based off of in the way that it looks? Does anybody happen to know?
Maybe the Taj Mahal.
Yes, and where is the Taj Mahal?
India.
And where is India?
On the map?
Yeah, well, that's more of a, I'm not gonna actually make you point out India. All the way over here, right? Not even a part of the Middle East as we think of it. So why is it that Aladdin, even though it's supposed to be taking place in Arabia, in this fictionalized place of Agrabah, there are heavily Arabic overtones? Why does it include something from India in it, right? Because of Orientalism. Because it's taking these vast cultures with all of these differences, and we'll spend some time looking at India as well in the imperial period. But also, if you watch the lecture on the Ottoman society, India was also the site of one of the three major Islamic societies, or Islamic empires. That is the Mughal Empire. We didn't talk about it very much. In fact, we didn't really talk about it at all in that lecture on the Ottoman society. But again, it's taking these vast ideas, these vast places, and just kind of condensing them down into one. And so, returning to the video, that hopefully makes us think a little bit more, right? That gives us kind of a concrete example of what he's talking about. Or how Cardi B, in her music video, can just like throw on a hijab and have camels in the desert, and all of a sudden, you know, oh, well, we must be in the Middle East. As if Dubai isn't one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world, and one of the most like developed cities in the world, right? If you didn't know that, now you do. And that's why you're taking this class, right? To learn. And the whole point why we're talking about modern civilizations and all of that.
The professor immediately prepared said the definition has evolved.
It's become to mean something else, a critique actually, or a particular way of knowing about that part of the world.
The late Palestinian-American professor, author, and activist Edward Said wrote the book on Orientalism, making his Palestinian-Arab identity central to his work.
And that is just the violence, etc., always associated with the Arabs, with Islam, and so on and so forth. Arabs are always being killed, they're always associated publicly in the public mind, public image with what is negative and regressive.
He called his book Orientalism, and it forever changed the way we think of Western depictions of the Arab and Muslim world. Said also said Orientalism relies on letting Westerners interact with the Orient without ever losing the upper hand. Basically, it's about power.
And his criticism was that the study of the scholarship about the Middle East and the Near East, South Asia, was really based on a lens of empire.
Said also said Orientalism presented imagery of a mysterious land full of secrets, monsters, and sensual women. But the depictions weren't just about exotic. Orientalist art and literature often served a more sinister purpose.
One of the most important ideas behind Orientalist art has been to show the Islamic world in a position of either moral or cultural inferiority to that.
And again, I do want to point out they're talking a lot about the Orient, or about like the Middle East, and about these typically Islamic societies, or typically what we might call the Arabic world. But like I said, we can also expand this to China, to Japan, to Vietnam, to Korea. I mean, if any of you are familiar with the place across the street, Love and Thai, if you're not, you should definitely try it out, especially if you haven't before. It's exceptional Thai food, but Love and Thai used to be located over near Tulare and 41, kind of at the crux, like where it starts to turn into downtown. However, and maybe some of you are familiar with it, or maybe some of you remember this from the news, maybe you don't, but there was just a random local woman who happened to be walking by it one day, and she noticed that at the house next to it, not even at the restaurant itself, but at the house next to it, there was a dog that was tied up out front and that was unaccompanied. And so her immediate reaction was to go to social media, to go to Facebook, and to make a Facebook post about how this Thai restaurant must be stealing dogs, killing them, and cooking them up and putting them in their food. Right? I see some laughs because it's like, that's absurd, right? They're not doing it. There's no, but people believed this. People thought this. Because of course, that has long been a stereotype of Asian cultures, that they eat dogs. Or they eat animals that we don't typically eat, right? You know, I mean, Americans don't, right? Typically we don't bat an eye, you know, if we're eating pig or, if we're eating pig or lamb or otherwise. Maybe horse, depending. Although if you go to Canada, you can get horse, which I highly recommend you try at some point in your life if you have. It's very good. But the whole point is of this, right, that they assumed that because there was a dog here, and because I know that Asian cultures tend to eat dogs or dirty or unclean things, that therefore this Thai place must be stealing dogs and cooking them up. And the owners of Love and Thai started getting death threats to them because of this, right? And that is what Orientalism is, right? It takes this vast culture, right? This vast complexity. I mean, after all, Thai food and Thai culture is from Thailand, right? It's not from Japan, it's not China, it's not Korea, it's none of that. But again, none of that matters because all of that has been kind of smashed together into some kind of amalgamation, right? Some kind of just blob of ideas that also includes, well, Asians eat dogs and therefore are barbaric, right? That's barbaric, it's cruel, how could they do that? Right, and again, with, of course, the point being that they don't do that, right? That's not something that is happening. But this is what we're talking about, and one of the reasons why we're spending a lot of time talking about this, because this will also show up when we move into later classes and other lectures about imperialism as Western powers begin to imperialize the global South, as we call it, Latin America, Africa, Asia, that based on these positions of power that they are put in, they will begin to characterize things about the West, about the people they are imperializing. And so we'll continue.
And according to Said, that desire to show Arabs and Muslims as morally less than had a very real impact on the everyday lives of people living in the so-called Orient, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. It doesn't just affect Arabs and Muslims, it can also affect Black Africans, Indians, and other Asians. Said's work dissected what media characterizations of Arabs and Muslims in Western news outlets looked like during and after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution.
It is from the mosques that opposition to the Shah is being led by puritanical Shiite Muslims. The religious zealots want to return to the Constitution of 1906.
The concept of Orientalism isn't just that there are issues with this painting or that novel, it's that this painting or that novel both create and perpetuate inaccurate portrayals of Muslims and Arabs. It dehumanizes anyone who falls into those groups and supports dangerous policies. And these stereotypes bring me back to Aladdin. The late Arab-American academic Jack Shaheen identified the Orientalist themes and tropes in Aladdin. After its 1992 debut, Shaheen campaigned to make Disney alter the opening song, Arabian Nights. And you probably don't remember this line.
When they come to your ears, they talk like your face is like that, but hey, it's home.
Seriously, he just referred to a made-up Arab land as barbaric, and put it to a children's book. Shaheen responded in the LA Times, and he said it was a painful reminder to 3 million Americans of Arab heritage, as well as 300 million Arabs and others, that the abhorrent Arab stereotype is as ubiquitous as Aladdin's lamp.
You might not be able to say that it's racist, but you can say it's a misrepresentation of cultures, it's a blending of cultures, all to serve the purpose of sort of mainstream American entertainment.
Shaheen also said these pictures would impact an audience's understanding of the Arab world and have a real-world impact with the negative portrayal of Agrabah, serving as what he called Hollywood's fabricated Arab. Well,
And if we think about the salesman from Aladdin here, who here is wearing this turban. So if you were unaware, first of all, not everybody in the Middle East wears turbans. In fact, most people in these Middle Eastern countries don't wear turbans. However, there is one religious group in the world that wears turbans. Well, there are more than one, but there is one religious group that makes it a focal point of their religious practice, of their devotion. Does anybody happen to know what that religion is? And so that religion is known as Sikhism, which is different from Islam, different from Judaism, different from Christianity, different from Buddhism, Hinduism, all of that. It is its own religion, following the teachings of its founder, Guru Nanak, who, again, wore a turban as a sign of religious devotion. And so, Sikhism is incredibly popular throughout the world, throughout even all these countries that we're talking about as well. And Sikhs have oftentimes lived in harmony and lived among all kinds of other religious traditions. In fact, if you need anything Indian food or otherwise, there's an Indian market up on Clovis and Kings Canyon where the owners are Sikh, and they have a picture of Guru Nanak above the counter place, and you can also buy some of Indian spices and otherwise all of that. Anyway, wonderful if you're ever looking for that kind of thing. But again, here, why I'm bringing this up is that in the aftermath of 9/11, right, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda attacks the World Trade Centers, the suicide bombers bring planes right into the two towers that crash, that kill about 3,000 people in total, right? And the major thing that the media lashes onto, because most of the media doesn't even know what Sikhs are, is they get portrayed with turbans. Now, the members of Al-Qaeda, of that terrorist organization, and even many Muslims don't wear turbans. It's not a part of their religious devotion, actively. The group that does, however, wear turbans are Sikhs. And in the aftermath of 9/11, Sikhs experienced, there was like multiple hundreds of % increase in hate crimes against Sikhs, who again had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, nothing to do with Afghanistan or the terrorist group Al-Qaeda or anything like that, who again are being beaten, who are being shot and killed by patriotic Americans who see them as the same people who just blew up the World Trade Centers and declared war on America. Right? That is where this is harmful. And that's also why we're spending so much time talking about it, right? Is because the knowledge is, I mean, that's obviously, you know, you're here because it's a GE credit, you kind of have to be in order to get your degree that you're working for. But also, knowledge is power in that, right? And it's through becoming more knowledgeable about these kinds of things and about these cultures and these traditions, especially those that are very different in some cases from our own, or from the ones we may be familiar with, right? It's through that we learn more about the world around us, and that we find ourselves in better positions to, again, be better citizens of the world, right? To be better citizens and be better human people in general. So, returning, and I'll see if I can get away with not pausing this anymore.
Hollywood's fabricated era. Well, he may be right. In 2015, as the U.S. bombed ISIS in Iraq and Syria, a poll found that 30% of Republican voters would support bombing Agrabah. And before you agree, Agrabah is the fictional country in Aladdin. It's not real. Other activist groups criticize the film's character portrayal with Aladdin and Jasmine having anglicized features and American accents.
You're not free to make your own choices. Sometimes you feel so you're just trapped.
And the rest have really thick Arabic accents and far less attractive physical.
I have to see dishes first, but I got it.
But Aladdin is not the only film in recent memory to use Oriental imagery. There's also Prince of Persia, Gods of Egypt, 300, Munich, Zero Dark 30, and American Flame. But that didn't stop some of those from winning Academy Awards. You might say Aladdin is old news. Why bring it up at all? Well, it's coming back as a live action feature, and it doesn't seem like much has changed at all. The movie's already been accused of whitewashing the story, with the creation of white characters like Prince Andrews.
If you're gonna spend a lot of money on it, you can't really do anything real. It has to be imaginative, it has to play with fantasy, and therefore has to rely on stereotypes.
Orientalist imagery has also managed to creep onto the small screen. Television shows like Homeland and 24 are among the biggest culprits, with Arabs and Muslims often portrayed as terrorists or violent individuals hell-bent on destroying the United States and or Western civilization. Homeland in particular frames Muslims as people you could never trust under any circumstances, even if they were your neighbor. But the terrorist trope is an old one.
The most famous sort of Oriental stereotype of terrorists, you see that heavily present in 1970s, 1980s, both literature and film. And today we see that becomes still a dominant trope.
The Brave is NBC's latest military drama, where good versus evil clash, and the evil happens to be Muslims. But there also happens to be one good Muslim working with the good guys.
In many ways, you could say that Hollywood mainstream movies have become a lot more self-aware about this kind of thing. And so they try to change it up or add a little more complexity, for example, by adding in a Muslim good character as a way to sort of balance out a Muslim villain.
And then there are music videos where Oriental images have been pervasive for a long time, but it's not as discussed as it is in other art forms. Which brings us back to Bodak Yellow's music video, where Cardi B shows up in Dubai, so mysterious, so rich, dresses up in Eric garb, so sensual, so exotic. Has a cheetah, which is dangerous, rides a camel across the desert, aka every Arab's backyard. Okay, so maybe Cardi has never even read every site and may not even know what we're talking about. But in her defense, she's not the only one doing it. There are plenty of other examples of musicians using Oriental images in today's music videos.
silencing the form of erasure of a culture, it's oversimplification, and people have a right to be insulted by that, and they have a right to protest and demand that they be treated with a little more respect.
So what will it take to ensure that we stop exoticizing the Arabs and Muslims in our movies, TV shows, and favorite music videos? Love you, Cardi B. Growing up, whenever I watched a lot of
And so again, like I said with the video that we watched about fast fashion on the first day of the course, and of course the implications that has for the environment, that has for global warming, that has for the old unused garments ending up on the shores, 15 million pieces a week on the shores of countries like Ghana or otherwise, right? Does that mean that you should you should never listen to Cardi B? Maybe, but not for that reason. Or that you shouldn't watch Aladdin or any of that, whatever. No, that's not what I'm trying to say, nor do I think that's a reasonable thing to say. But again, it's just that part of that being aware, right, of developing that sort of critical engagement with the way that we think about the world and the way that we think about the media that we are presented with, right? And so we'll kind of transition now into talking about China and the Ming and the Qing dynasties. But before we do that, are there any comments, any questions, anything that I can answer or clarify? All right, so moving along then to China. So, like I said, we are picking up with our lecture on China from the Ming Dynasty. So, it is underneath the Ming Dynasty that China will expand, or that it will overtake Tibet, that it will overtake portions of even Mongolia, and that will set it up to become the kind of gigantic landmass that we see in the Qing era. So it's underneath the Ming Dynasty, which again will last until roughly 1644, so until the middle of the 17th century. But it is during this dynasty that we see China really enter into this place of cultural power. And not just of cultural power, but even of economic power. I mean, keep in mind, China has been running the Silk Road for hundreds of years by this point. China exports so many different luxury goods to Europe and to the rest of the world for this point. And it has. I mean, silk for one of them, right? Silk, of course, being very fine, very precious, and again, produced in China. Beyond that, there are certain spices and teas as well that are produced in China, right? I mean, tea is not something that you grow in Britain, right? The reason why, Britain's obsession with tea is partially also based on their obsession with empire, and of course, with coming to imperialize a lot of places around the world, like India, like China, like other places in East Asia as well, where tea can be grown. Beyond that, China is also known for its porcelain, which is also why the type of silverware that your grandma or your grandparents never let you touch because it's the nice silverware, and someday I guess you'll use, I don't know. My grandparents never ended up using theirs. But what do we call that synonym? What's the synonym for that porcelain?
Fine China.
China! It literally gets named after the place it's exported from, right? So China exports all of these luxury goods. And the thing about that is that China doesn't really need anything in return. That is, China has all of the food it could possibly want through, of course, rice, which is essentially as effective, if not even more effective than growing grain, like Europe has. right, China has that. China has an abundance of natural resources like minerals and other materials. Think, for example, of jade and other fancy minerals that are brought up. Again, these things that the rest of the world wants, and because China has what the world wants, and China needs nothing from the world, China is able to set the terms of trade with itself, which, as we'll see, China is going to demand silver. And this is really going to become a problem during the Qing dynasty, where the rest of the powers, especially Europe, and especially Britain, don't want to be sending all of their silver to China. But silver is the only thing China will accept, because it doesn't matter how many other goods you have if China also has those, or has the equivalencies of those, right? Ideally, you might trade based on, I have this product and you have this product, but, what do we do? China has a very strong position here. And so, which is why I mentioned that with the start of the Ming Dynasty and as it comes along to fruition, there are sort of three main achievements that lay the foundation for Chinese dominance of basically Europe, if not, honestly, parts of the world by the Qing Dynasty and by the 18th century. So, the first is that underneath the Ming Dynasty, there is a stabilization of Chinese culture and society that lasts for about 300 years. That is, prior to the Ming Dynasty, there had been lots of fightings, there had been excursions by the Mongols who lived to the north of China and who existed as an ever-present threat. The Mongols were simply a nomadic, so a horseback people who would regularly come through, would raid villages on the edge of the Chinese Empire, would steal and plunder and all of that, right? There are all of these problems. Moreover, China was also not exempt at points from multiple civil wars, from otherwise, and so one of the things that the Ming Dynasty manages to do is that the Ming Dynasty manages to stabilize it. And so with this stabilization, because now, and this is all kind of interrelated, which is why we're going to go down to bullet point 3, skipping over 2 for the moment, is that it's during the Ming Dynasty that the Great Wall of China is built. And again, one of the major reasons for the construction of the Great Wall of China is to prevent the Mongols from raiding the edges of the Chinese Empire. Because that, like I said, that's a big problem. Because again, the Mongols themselves are nomadic. That means they're tribal people. They don't build permanent cities or permanent societies, but rather largely they exist as people who go and plunder and steal and take from others. And they may have caught historically people from that area. Of course, I mean, Genghis Khan is probably the most famous who comes to mind. But they have caused problems for empires in Europe and Asia since, basically since time immemorial with that. And so the Great Wall of China is a way to keep them out. And with that, of course, it also leads to a great drain on Chinese resources. China, and we're just going to kind of bounce back and forth between the bullet points here and between the slides, right? One of the things that China also does during the Ming Dynasty is because it builds the Great Wall, because because there's no war and no fighting, it's able to establish healthy and dominant trade networks, is that China becomes real wealthy during the Ming Dynasty, largely due to trade. But also, again, due to all these other things as well. Because it's kind of difficult to have trade routes if your trade routes run the risk of being plundered by Mongols or by raiders or by all these other things, or if there's civil war, right? It's kind of hard to have flourishing trade when the people of your empire are fighting each other. And so all of this stability, the Great Wall, that comes together, those increased Chinese material wealth, Chinese economic wealth, they are flourishing during the Ming Dynasty. And one of the major ways in which they flourish is with, like I said, those trade routes. And I want to very quickly just watch the first 6 minutes of this video that will require a lot less pausing than the previous one did. Because one of the largest strengths of the Ming Dynasty was basically a ship merchant, a naval merchant by the name of Zhang Ha, who was a navigator that basically is responsible for creating maritime or ocean trade routes with the societies of East Asia. Not only with Japan, but also, not only with Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia and all of those areas, but also with the Pacific Islands, with places like Malaysia, with places like Korea, right? All of that kind of island civilizations that exist across the Southeast Pacific. And with this, what's even more impressive is that, again, I mean, I would almost wager money that nobody in here has ever heard of Zhang Ha prior to this moment. Even though, of course, we're all familiar with people like Christopher Columbus, and maybe even, depending, some of the other European explorers like Francis Drake, Ferdinand Magellan, Vasco da Gama, all of these. But either way, Christopher Columbus definitely. But Zhang Ha is doing the exact same thing that they are all doing, but largely before they do. And it's through this that, again, China is going to gain a lot of its wealth. And so we're just going to watch the first 6 minutes of this crash course video that explains Zhang Ha and all of that.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course. Well, this we're going to do some deserved recognition in history, but what's really the greatest hero? Let's begin with Zhang Ha, who's probably the greatest admiral you've never heard of. Couple of important things about Zhang Ha. First, he was a Muslim. That may be strange until you consider that by the late 14th century, China had long experience with Muslims, especially when they were ruled by, wait for it, the Mongols. Secondly, Zhang Ha was a eunuch. Fortunately, 15th century China had excellent general anesthesia, so I'm sure it didn't hurt at all when they captured him. What's that? They didn't have general anesthesia? Oh, Stan, I'm seeing it. I can see it. Stan, show me something too right now. Oh, there's Kitty. How'd you get something to do, John? Thank you, Stan. Right, so John.
And so I said I would try not to pause it, so I'll make this quick. But, I mean, even there, notice, right, that Zhang Ha is a Muslim. It's not very often that we think of Islam and China being two things that go together, or two things that exist, right? But they did, because of trade, and again, because of the flow of ideas along the Silk Road, from civilization to civilization. And of course, because India, which borders China, also has a large Muslim population, thanks to the thanks to the Mughal Empire. It also has a large Hindu population for that same reason. So again, it is not uncommon to find Muslims in China, which is not really what we think about when we think of China, especially historically.
Ha rose from humble beginnings to the potent testicles and become the greatest admiral in Chinese history. Let's go to the thought. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang Ha led 7 voyages throughout the Indian Ocean, the expeditions of these so-called treasure ships. And they were huge. Columbus's first voyage consisted of 3 ships. Zhang Ha led an armada of over 300 with a crew of over 27,000, more than half of London's population at the time. And some of these ships were, well, enormous. The flagships, known as the treasure ships, were over 400 feet long and had 7 or more masts. You see that tiny little ship there in front of the treasure ship? That's a Pintail reservation for Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. Zhang Ha wasn't an explorer. The Indian Ocean trade routes were already known to him and to other Chinese sailors. He visited Africa, India, and the Middle East, and in a way, his journeys were trade missions, but not in the sense of filling his ships up with stuff to be sold later for higher prices. At the time, China was the leading manufacturer of quality goods in the world, and there wasn't anything they actually needed to import. What they needed was prestige and respect, so that people would continue to see China as the center of the economic universe. So there was a tribute system through which foreign rulers or their ambassadors would come to China and engage in a debasing ritual called the kowtow, wherein they acknowledged the superiority of the Chinese emperor and offered him
or usually him, gives in exchange for the right to trade with China. The opportunity to humble yourself before the Chinese emperor was so valuable that many a prince was happy to jump on a trade ship and sail back to China with John.
And it involves actually bowing before the emperor.
Lots of great
In that.
in China, including exotic animals. From Africa, John Han brought back a zoo's worth of rhinos, zebras, and even giraffes. Basically, it was like the medieval Chinese military. So the Chinese were world leaders in naval technology, and they wanted to dominate trade here in the Indian Ocean. So why then did these voyages end? One reason was that John Han couldn't live forever, and sure enough, he didn't. Also, his patron, the Yongle Emperor, died, and the emperor's successors weren't as interested in maritime trade. They were more concerned with protecting China against traditional enemies, nomads from the steppe. To do this, they built a rather famous wall. The Great Wall was mostly built under the Ming Dynasty using resources that they only had because they stopped building gigantic ships. And just imagine what might have happened if the Ming emperors had embraced a different strategy, one that was based on outreach instead of isolation. And now to the blue corner representing Portuguese exploration.
And so that's the deal with Zhang Ha. And you can see how, like I've said, everything kind of comes together with that. And that this largely not only builds Chinese wealth, but also Chinese influence. I mean, to the point where they're trading as far as Africa, right? And eventually they'll start trading with Europeans. Once Europeans, of course, like we talked about in the transatlantic slave trade lecture, once they learn how to build caravels and develop map-making techniques that allow them to navigate across oceans. And in fact, this is just something that I like to point out, just because I find etymologies or the meanings of words really cool. And one of the things that you wouldn't necessarily expect is that, so the Portuguese, before the Spanish, were like the first Europeans to really get on the exploration train. They were the first people to really go out with their caravels and to begin exploring and creating these kind of international trade routes, as we could call them. So naturally, the Portuguese are the first Europeans to really come into contact with the Japanese. And with that, this leads to the trade routes between the Portuguese and between the Japanese, and later between the Spanish and the Japanese, lead to both the languages of Portuguese and the language of Spanish having a lot of words in common with Japanese, thanks to the trade of the two. So, for example, will somebody remind me, what is the word for soap in Spanish? Does anybody know? Is it jabón? Yeah. Jabón, yeah. It's the same thing. It's sabon in Japanese of that. So again, this very close relationship between these words, or even the fact that the reason we call the leader of a ship an admiral is, and this is more to do with Spanish trade with the Arabic world, is because the Arabic word for leader is amir. Amir, or if it's a woman leader, amira. And so, one of the ways that they would be addressed as Amir al-Basar, the leader so-and-so. But the Spanish mishear that as Amiral, like Amir al-Basar, which leads them to develop the word admiral from that. Right? So just kind of one of those things that's very, very peripherally related, but also an interesting example of how languages that we might not expect to have anything in common with each other, through interaction, through trade, through all of that, end up becoming common. Or at least having some kind of common roots based on what it is that they trade. And so the major influence of the Ming Dynasty, right, are these three main achievements. And what the Ming Dynasty does is set the way for the Qing Dynasty, which will take over in 1644. However, so the Qing Dynasty is founded by a people who are not actually Chinese, at least not from China proper, but rather by a group of people known as the Manchu, who come from Manchuria, which is a little area to the north of China. If we look at here on the map, if you go all the way up to the top right corner, right to the northeast of Mongolia, you'll see Manchuria. They are through a bunch of dynastic Chinese politics that we aren't going to get into. They end up taking over from the Ming Dynasty and establishing the Qing Dynasty that will really not look too much different from the Ming Dynasty. In fact, sometimes scholars even combine the two together, referring to them collectively as the Ming-Qing dynasty, because largely the Manchu, when they come in, they don't really change anything as to how the Ming were operating. But they do, of course, adopt the Chinese culture. They do, of course, keep the different Chinese religious and social traditions. And they move on with the conquering of most of Asia, as exemplified here by everything that is in yellow and with the black outline, being what Qing China will eventually look like. And like I said, the Qing dynasty is going to be the last Chinese dynasty. Eventually, they'll be ousted from power in 1911 after what Chinese historians and many Chinese people refer to as the century of disaster, which should tell you something about where exactly Chinese history is made at this point, which we will be discussing. And spoilers, the British are involved in causing that and in making that happen. And so, with this, the other important thing to note about this map is that even if the Qing dynasty does not include things like, for example, portions of what we call Vietnam, which here is labeled Annam for its kind of indigenous name, Siam, which is the old name for Thailand, that even Korea, you'll notice that they exist as tributary states, right? So all of them pay tribute to China, despite not being a part of the Qing Empire. And with this, we can see that it's not really a surprise, right? It's not really a surprise that the Qing dynasty has all of the power and the influence that it does. And so, to kind of illustrate this, and this is what we'll finish up class with. So in 1793, an embassy led by a British lord by the name of Macartney arrives at China. So he has been sent by King George III, the same King George, of course, who was the King of Britain during the American Revolution, and the same King George who oversees basically 25% of the the world at this point as subjects of the British Empire. So even though they've just lost the 13 colonies, this is Britain as it is approaching its height. The 19th century is going to be the century of Great Britain in terms of where it moves to, where it dominates. But Britain is one of the most powerful European states at this moment in history, in 1793. And so Britain wants more trade routes with China. And so in order to establish this, they send this British lord in order to go and to petition the Chinese emperor to bring them, basically to open more trade routes with them, to let them have more ports where their ships can dock and trade, and to basically be a bit more favorable to the British. And so we're going to look at and read just a short document to finish up, which is going to be the letter, or at least an excerpt of the letter that the Emperor Qianlong at the time, of what he sends basically back to King George III, from one monarch to another. And so you can just take it and pass it down. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go through this together as a class and kind of look at look at this document and then to really think about what it shows us about not only the relationship between China and Britain, but also about how China views themselves with this. And so I'll read the first paragraph. So it says, yesterday your ambassador petitioned my ministers. And this is, think of the emperor. The emperor's not actually writing this. He's dictating it to a scribe who's then writing it down. But he says, to memorialize me regarding your trade with China. But his proposal is not consistent with our dynastic usage and cannot be entertained. Hitherto, to this point, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with our celestial empire at Canton. Canton being one of the major trading ports that was available. Such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. But as the sea, silk, and porcelain which the celestial empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted as a signal mark of favor that foreign hongs, merchant firms, should be established at Canton so that your wants might be supplied and your country thus participate in our beneficence. Beneficence just being like our goodwill, our good favor. So just given this paragraph, if you can raise your hand and give an answer. How does China view themselves? And what shows us in this first paragraph how China views themselves? Yeah.
I think they view themselves as kind of like essentially the greatest country or the greatest civilization among anything else. I mean, they call themselves, or at least with this translation, the Celestial Empire, which kind of views them as like essentially kind of like God-like.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Absolutely. And in Chinese civilization, there is this concept known as the mandate of heaven, which basically says that it's the equivalent. It's literally just the Chinese version of divine right monarchy, like what we saw when we looked at England and France. The idea that God has ordained the king. God has ordained the king, and therefore they have the favor and can act like that. And so yeah, the Celestial Empire, all of that, that's the mandate of heaven. So yeah, exactly right, they view themselves as this almost quasi-divine empire. Yeah. Other thoughts about other ways that they view themselves with examples? Remember too, part of your grade in class does come from participation, which sometimes is through writing, but also other times is through speaking. Yeah.
I think kind of going along with what we already talked about is with their produce and like their the things that they produce. The European nations need those things more than China would need any of their produce or anything that they produce. So I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the celestial part that we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then right, that with that they're, I mean, after all, what do divine beings do? What do gods do but give, right? Give benevolently to, right, to their subjects or to people they're with. Yeah, and so others, there's, specifically, there's a certain word that's used a number of times throughout this first paragraph that I want to hit on before we move on to the next couple of paragraphs. But what is the word, what, somebody else can answer this who hasn't spoken yet, what is the word that they continually use to refer to them? Yeah?
Is it barbarian?
Barbarian, yeah. And what's odd, and you can answer this or somebody else can raise their hand and answer this. But what's odd about them using the word barbarian, Chinese people, using the word barbarian to refer to Europe, to refer to Britain? Yeah, say a little more.
I don't know, just the way, like taking the context and the way it's being used, it makes it seem like, I don't know what way to explain it, but like a bad way, or like maybe even aggressive. I don't know what word to put it.
Yeah, definitely aggressive.
Yeah, that's kind of building off of what she was saying, kind of like savage or like uncivilized.
Yeah.
Inhumane.
Yeah, and of course, how often is it that somebody calls Britain a savage or uncivilized? The same Britain who, again, is currently like undergoing parts of enlightenment, right? Whose colonies have just declared independence. Like the same Britain that exists that owns like 25% of the world's landmass at that point, right? To say them just to say, we're doing you savages a favor. I mean, it's the same language that Europe uses to talk about the Americas, about the New World, about the indigenous people, right? Which is one of the reasons why I like this letter and like talking about it, because at one point, right, that the Chinese are able to kind of talk about Britain like this, and we'll move into the second paragraph about this. It says, "But your ambassador has now put forward new requests which completely fail to recognize the throne's principle to treat strangers from afar with indulgence, and to exercise a pacifying control over barbarian tribes the world over." Basically, what you've asked us to open more trading ports is unreasonable, and just like, how could you ask that, right? And he goes on to say, right, our dynasty, swaying the myriad races of the globe, extends the same benevolence towards all. And he says, and this is at the very end, this is what I want to talk about and comment on. He says, "Nevertheless, I do not forget the lonely remoteness of your island, cut off from the world by intervening wastes of sea. Nor do I overlook your excusable ignorance of the usages of our celestial empire." If we were to take that last line about the lonely remoteness of your island, cut off from the world by intervening wastes of sea, what is he saying about Britain there? What is the Chinese imperial court saying about Britain? Who wants to come and trade with them, and who wants to think that they're better than, all of the other people who come to trade with China? Yeah.
Kind of thinks that Britain is smaller than it actually is.
Yeah, which again, I mean, if you think about it, like in a literal, objective sense, he's not wrong. Britain is a small island in the middle of the ocean, cut off from like the rest of mainland Europe and other things. I mean, granted, it uses its navy for imperial power and manages to get in on the imperialism game, but he is just to just write Britain off like it's just out there floating along like on a lifeboat in the middle of nowhere. This will come back and be incredibly relevant when Britain comes back to fight China in the Opium Wars. Britain will not forget that they were insulted like this in 1793, and largely it is what's going to Britain. I mean, I don't want to spoil too much much or preview too much. But the long story short is that Britain is going to get the entirety of China hooked on opium in order to sell it in China, against the wishes of China. And that is only the beginning of what exactly Britain will do. And so there's a backside to this that talks, kind of more about this. But he even goes on to attack Christianity here, because keep in mind, Christian missionaries have been coming to China and have been coming to Japan, and largely they were allowed to operate, provided that they operated within the correct channels in China, and also provided that they didn't upset kind of the Confucian, which is the kind of philosophy religion that at least the Chinese Empire, or the imperial court, kind of described to. As long as you don't undermine the emperor and don't undermine the mandate of heaven and these Confucian ideas, you can spread your religions as you want, as long as it's harmless for that. And he even goes on to say, right, regarding your nation's worship of the Lord of heaven, it is the same religion as that of other European nations. Ever since the beginning of history, sage emperors and wise rulers have bestowed on China a moral system and inculcated a code, which from time immemorial has been religiously observed from the myriads of my subjects. There has been no hankering after heterodox doctrines. And there, heterodox is just a large word to say heretical doctrines. And so he is referencing here, of course, the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the wars of religion, Britain's own civil war, in which Protestants fought and murdered and killed Catholics, who fought and murdered and killed Protestants, right? He goes on to attack this because you can't even get your religion under control, right? You can't even decide what it is that you believe. Meanwhile, China is over here as like the undisputed Chad of history, right? Having worshipped the same religion, or the same, obviously they haven't. It's rhetorical, right? Largely as just a way to but also Confucianism has played a large role in Chinese history. All of that. But again, it's that, right, that allows for China to talk to Britain like this. And again, this is kind of what we'll sort of leave on, or what we'll end with, is that it should show us, along with what we've talked about England, about the Ottoman Empire, about the indigenous peoples of the Americas, about all of that, that the dichotomy, that is, that black and white, strict, sharp line between civilized and uncivilized, really isn't something that exists at all, right? I mean, we see here that, civilization depends on who's talking about civilization, right? To the Europeans, the people of the Orient, right, looking at that kind of Orientalism, right, they're the ones who seem savage and uncivilized. Whereas to the Chinese, who have everything under the sun they could possibly want, who live in a time of relative prosperity, of economic and social and cultural prosperity, right, view Europe and England as barbaric, right? And so hopefully, again, the whole point of all of this is to get us, not with us, but to get us to think about history more critically in that way. It's about the stories and the narratives and everything that is told. So, are there any questions?